Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck here. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, certainly no exception. Very pleased to have with us Justin Martin. Who's Justin Martin, you ask? Well, he's many things. He is a prolific author and author of 3 previous works. We're going to talk about one today, very special. But most recently, Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted. He has written also Greenspan, The Man Behind the Money, best-selling biography by the New York Times Book Review as a notable author, and also Nader, Crusader, Spoiler, and Icon. He has Kansas roots, which we will discuss as well, but we're talking about a brand new work called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. Justin, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, we are very pleased to have you here talking about Walt Whitman and all things Bohemian. Let's do this. Let's share with our Lewis at Large listeners here in Lawrence, Kansas, a little bit about your background and how authorship came to you.
Sure. Well, I always wanted to be a writer, and it was something in fact, when I was growing up, I had a little tiny newspaper that I delivered around my neighborhood that I did on my mom's. I would use Ditto Masters on my mom's Olivetti typewriter, and it was called the Old West Lawrence Zip. And I would carry it around and deliver it to various people in the neighborhood. I charged them $0.05 a month, which was a good amount of money for an 8-year-old. And I remember one of the topics I covered was Nixon's resignation back in the 70s.
1974.
74, exactly. That would have been the Old West Lawrence Zip would have attended. I'm not sure we had as sort of deep insight into it as Woodward and Bernstein, but I covered in the Old West Lawrence Zip. So always wanted to be a writer, and sort of a typical story. Graduated college and headed off to New York City, and started out doing very small stuff, for various local papers, and then sort of penny savers and so forth, and kind of worked my way slowly up.
Well, again, I admit I was not aware that you were from Lawrence until we talked a little bit off the air. Tell us a little bit about how Lawrence shaped maybe who you are and maybe some of the style and the influence into your writing.
Sure. Well, Lawrence, as anybody who has grown up there or lived there for a time will know, is it's a really vibrant community. It's a college town. It's a place where you could get as much culture in Lawrence as you can anywhere in the world. You can be exposed to all kinds of interesting things. I happened to grow up there in the late 60s and early 70s, so that was a pretty dramatic, exciting time to be there. My dad was a professor at the University of Kansas. My mom at that time actually worked for the University Press of Kansas as an editor. So both just in the environment around Lawrence and at home with my parents, I was exposed to lots of interesting things, lots of interesting dinner table conversation, and all of that, sort of pushed me in that direction.
Well, the work, and we can talk about a lot of your previous works, but let's do a little focus here on Rebel Souls. This is an extraordinary look and a glimpse into a very special time in early American history. Of a group, the lives of obviously of Walt Whitman, but also those of who he associated with, at a very special place in New York City, and beyond that, poor setup right there. Give us a little bit of background about why Walt Whitman and this entire subject of sort of America's first bohemian / creative / sort of doers was of such interest to you.
The reason this is interest to me was because this was just, it was for all the biographies there have been of Walt Whitman, typically they devote, maybe a paragraph or two to the 4 really important formative years he spent at this fast saloon. And the cast of characters he was surrounded by, everybody from Fitzhugh Ludlow, who wrote one of the best-selling books of 1857, The Hashish Eater, to Artemus Ward, who is America's first stand-up comic, were fascinating figures who had been where Whitman has lived on in people's estimation and people's as a grand figure, although his participation in FAFSA has been lost. The other members of this artistic circle have been completely lost in history. And so I had the opportunity to write the first book ever about this collection of people that hung out in this saloon. I was very drawn to that. I was very drawn to the idea of kind of reviving this lost group of very interesting artists.
So in many ways, it was just simply the local watering hole for a group of people that at the time may or may not have had a high profile, but ultimately all did.
Yeah, well, it was a very carefully constructed group. This guy named Henry Clapp, who was the head of the group and was often called the King of Bohemia, he'd headed over to Paris at just the right time, 1849. He'd been exposed to Parisian-style Bohemia, so you can kind of credit him. He's the person that's rightly credited with importing both the term Bohemian from Paris and also sort of the lifestyle. I'm bringing it over to America, and so he had, at this saloon, he had a long table that was capable of seating 30 people. And so, although it had the casual feel of a saloon, the people that actually earned seats at that table, they had to show their wit, basically. They had to distinguish themselves among the many people who hoped to sit down at that table. So, Henry Clapp, who was kind of a ferocious guy, if somebody didn't fit at that table, if they weren't able to sort of parry wits with him or what have you, he would drive them off. And so, what you had was an engaging group of people. It's a little bit almost like something like the Algonquin Round Table, where yes, it was a casual group of people, sort of hanging out in the saloon. At the same time, the people who earned entry along that long table, they had to be fast on their feet, and they also usually had to have something on the ball artistically to sort of earn a spot there.
Share with Justin, if you would, put a little bit sharper point on the definition of what a Bohemian truly is.
Sure. Well, in the original Parisian model, Bohemians, and they hung out at the cafes. It actually became a lifestyle that had certain components. Those components included just an almost pathological fear of conventionality, an intense passion for art. It often was accompanied by sexual openness, was certainly one of the hallmarks of that original French Bohemia, and also with all that other stuff, certainly came kind of hand in glove, often substance abuse. Well, Henry Clapp, he certainly liked the fact that these different attributes, particularly things like the intense unconventionality, the passion for art, he liked the fact that it had been codified in Paris and given a name, Bohemian, and so he wanted to import this lifestyle to America. Of course, there's always been Bohemians, but to actually create a kind of an organized Bohemia under that name, that was his innovation.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck here of Lewis at Large Radio. And in this segment, got a good one going here with Justin Martin, local kid, a townie, right, Justin?
And that is right.
Yes, he is. His first claim to fame, of course, the editor of the world-famous Old West Lawrence Zip of the early 70s and mid-70s, and has gone on now to some other work that he does, including a brand new work called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians. Justin, as you were doing this research, Walt Whitman is your focus, but what did you learn about the others that surrounded Walt at the bar that really surprised you?
I think it was just a fascinating cast of characters. I mean, Walt Whitman, it's not for nothing that he's a sort of an immortal artistic figure. He's a grand and fascinating figure, and of course I learned a lot about him and his characters in my research, but then his supporting cast who've kind of fallen into obscurity. These were some pretty remarkable, accomplished people. Everyone from Artemus Ward, who I mentioned earlier, who was America's very first pioneering stand-up comic, to a woman named Ada Isaacs Minkin, who became famous during the 1850s and early 1860s for her role in a play called Mazeppa, where she came to be known as the Naked Lady. I always thought along this table where you had a big volume of personality. Ada Isaacs Minkin may have had the biggest personality of any of these people, and she was, in her day, a big international star, someone who Dickens came backstage to see when she performed her play Mazeppa, someone who had an affair with Alexander Dumas, the author of the Three Musketeers. So she was a big personality in her day. Lost in time now, but it was exciting to come into contact and then to learn more about this really colorful cast.
What, you say the name Walt Whitman, everyone kind of nods their head and said, yeah, I know who that is. But if you press them on it, they can't go very deep with that. Tell us about Walt Whitman and what you believe his primary contribution was. And again, take us deeper into Walt Whitman, his psyche, his personality, and what do we not know about him that we need to know?
Sure. Well, he was also a great innovator. He's really credited with being the person who pioneered free verse. So verse that's lacking in meter and rhyme, as so much modern poetry is. But he's really the innovator behind that at a time when poems tended to be kind of stuffy, rhyming couplets. He came up with this, what at the time, I mean, now it feels the way poetry reads. It doesn't have to rhyme, it doesn't have to have a rigid meter. But when he came out with his new form of poetry, it was shocking, cutting-edge stuff. Not only did he, but he matched his shocking, cutting-edge stylistic approach to poetry with shocking, cutting-edge subject matter. His poetry on the eve of the Civil War, a lot of his poems dealt with the dissolution of the Union. A lot of his poems also dealt with romance between men, which was a pretty bold theme to be addressing in the 1850s. In fact, Fast Saloon, the saloon that he hung out in with this group of artists, it was a very kind of an open, libertine saloon, for lack of a better term. There were a lot of gay men there. You had the long table with the 30 artists, some of whom were also gay, but you also had out in the main room, beyond that long table, you had lots of different people who didn't exactly fit into conventional society, including lots of gay men. Whitman met a lot of these gay men at the saloon, and so when he wrote poetry that was inspired by his time at Fast Saloon, a lot of this poetry had to do with romantic attachments to men. Also, very bold stuff that, particularly for the era, for the 1850s.
Justin. Let's talk also, I think we have to talk about this. I think it's not, maybe it's implied, but it doesn't seem to be given as much credit as it should. If these people were gathering in Raleigh, North Carolina, it would be one thing. They're gathering in New York City at a really interesting, complicated time in the history of that city. How do you think that environment may have changed or altered or certainly flavored how they all looked at things and how they discussed things?
Well, it was a classic thing where New York City to this day remains a place where a lot of people go if they don't fit into their community. And so these, you had a case, for instance, America's first stand-up comic. He's this guy who grew up in a little kind of conservative town in Maine, and he made his way ultimately to New York City. Ada Isaacs Minkin, who I described earlier, the Naked Lady, she grew up in a little community on the banks of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. She probably didn't fit into her community, but New York City was a place where these kind of rebellious spirits could gather, could get sustenance from the life of the city and also from being in a group with one another. And then they, in turn, they achieve the shining moments of their lives, sort of being in collaboration, being along that table, being able to share their work with one another, sort of drove them to greater heights and allowed these sort of outliers, these kind of rebellious people, to really do their finest work and really kind of achieve their artistic destiny.
Part of this group, as we touched on earlier, were the Booth brothers, a group actors, indeed. Tell us, amazingly here, tell us about the real John Wilkes Booth, who was part of this group.
Sure. Well, you had, in the Booth brothers, you had a kind of an acting dynasty of the 19th century. Their father had been, Junius Booth Sr. had been come to be known as a mad tragedian. He was a great actor in the first part of the 19th century. Well, three of his sons were professional actors, and the best known of them as an actor was Edwin Booth. Edwin actually had a lot of talent as an actor. John Wilkes was, by all accounts, strikingly handsome. That was how he kind of got by as an actor. Not a very good actor. He was not very disciplined. He had very strange mannerisms on stage. He often forgot his lines. He often was sloppy or inconsistent in his performances. But the Booth family had grown up in Maryland, and Maryland was a border state on the eve of the Civil War. Some people in Maryland lean towards the South in their allegiance. Some lean towards the North. The entire Booth family, except for John Wilkes, leaned towards the North. They were, just one measure or not, abolitionists. John Wilkes had gone to school with some sons of Southern plantation owners, and he developed a kind of a passion or a commitment to Southern aristocracy and slaveholding. So he deviated from the rest of the family in that regard. So what you have are the ingredients for, of course, one of the terrible events in American history. You have a frustrated and not particularly talented actor who has a particular inclination or feels a certain allegiance to the Southern aristocracy, and of course, with John Wilkes Booth, the rest is history.
Did that surprise you at all? Was there you thought, wow, this really is amazing, or is that something that sort of is common knowledge to us commoners, or not common knowledge to us commoners?
I think two things amaze me with John Wilkes Booth. One is that he was able. His scheme was to kill Lincoln was so harebrained. He literally showed up at the Ford Theater on Friday morning to pick up his mail and learned that Lincoln was going to be there that night. And in an improvisational way, he contrived to assassinate Lincoln, and he succeeded. Why did he succeed? Such a different era. Lincoln was in a box that had 2 unlocked doors. That's all that stood between him and Booth. 2 unlocked doors. There should have been a single D.C. police officer, Washington, D.C. police officer, assigned to Lincoln that night. It was such a different, relaxed era that one lone police officer who was on security detail got bored in the middle of the play and decided to go to a nearby tavern and have a drink. So when John Wilkes Booth arrived, all he had to do was open 2 unlocked doors, level his Derringer pistol, and kill the president. It just shows what a different, more sort of casual era it was. That surprised me in my research, learning a lot more about that. The other thing, which is really, really significant in the book, is that one of the witnesses to Lincoln's assassination was Walt Whitman's lover at the time, a man named Peter Doyle. He was literally in the theater that night. He heard the shot. He turned around. He saw Lincoln with his chin slumped on his chest. He saw John Wilkes Booth jump out of the box where Lincoln had been watching the play, down onto the stage, and run out the back door to his getaway horse. The fact that Peter Doyle observed this firsthand, he then communicated that on to Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was because Walt Whitman was he had an almost mystical sense of the American Union, and when when Lincoln was assassinated, Whitman was devastated. Well, this firsthand account that Peter Doyle was able to pass along to Whitman helped inform some of the greatest poetry Whitman ever wrote. And so that to me was just electrifying stuff to learn about this sort of one person removed opportunity Whitman had to witness Lincoln's assassination.
Do you think, and again, it may be related again to the book, The Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians, do we have a great enough appreciation for Walt Whitman and the contributions that he made, because it transcended lots of different disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Walt Whitman has gotten his due from the standpoint that he's one of those figures like Shakespeare or Beethoven. You mention his name just so that everybody can say who that is. So I'd say he's gotten his due. And of course, there are people who are fervent fans of his, scholars studying him, around the world to this day. But there's a reason for it too. I mean, he wrote poetry that still holds up. I mean, you can read certain Whitman poems here 150 years after he wrote them, and they don't feel like some dry historical. I mean, they feel dynamic, fresh, moving. That's like Shakespeare. That's to his great credit. He's written what, at this point at least, remains timeless poetry. The other thing was as a person, he believed that art wasn't the highest calling. That he was a deeply ethical person. And during the Civil War, he actually went down, stopped writing poetry for a while. Instead, during this terrible, terrible crisis in the life of our nation, he spent 3 years during the Civil War attending to and helping out the wounded soldiers in the hospitals in and around Washington, D.C. And if you were to ask him why he was doing this, he would have said, this was a calling higher than art. This was, there were people injured, there were people maimed in this war. He was attending to them, and this was as I said, higher than art. So both as an artist and as a person, he's a grand American historical figure who's well worth attending to, and well worth anybody could find pleasure, if they're not so familiar with him, in learning more about him.
These guys hung out, as you said, in the basement, the bar in the basement of the Coleman House Hotel at 647 Broadway in New York. If I go to 647 Broadway today, what's there?
What you're going to find is a woman's discount shoe store. This was a basement saloon that these as you said, that these artists hung out in, and that
right.
long table with and the basement of that shoe store, which is it's gone through 150 years of different tenants and different renovations, so it bears no physical resemblance to the saloon that people once were occupying, but it's the same physical space. Now, where once Walt Whitman and Artemus Ward and Ada Menken gathered along that table, you would now find various boxes of women's shoes piled high.
Boy, that table, as they say, if that table could talk, it would be an interesting thing indeed. As some of these guys, Artemus Ward being one of them, and several of the other ones, obviously, sadly, died early. Walt Whitman aged and aged and aged. I'm curious as to, in the research that you were doing, did they continue to go to the basement of the hotel and enjoy themselves, or was that just a brief period and then they moved on?
It was a brief period for really all of these folks, and a lot of them, as you mentioned, died young. So after the Civil War ended, it was almost as if, I kind of likened it to the darkness of Lincoln's assassination. It almost bled out and infected these various members of this bohemian set. They'd sort of had their time of ascendancy in the late 1850s and early 1860s. By just a few years after the Civil War ended, most of these people were dead, so they couldn't go to Pfaff's saloon if they'd wanted to. Whitman, on the other hand, he stayed friends with Henry Clapp, the King of the Bohemians, and he made his last appearance at Pfaff's. He went to visit in 1881. That would have been, about almost 30 years after his first visit. And at this point, he was much older. And in fact, Pfaff's Saloon had moved up to 24th Street. It had moved from Broadway and Bleecker up to 24th Street in Manhattan. And over the years, the saloon had grown much, much more respectable. But Whitman, this was a place that was really of great significance to him. So he was, even though it wasn't the same old Pfaff's it had been, he was glad to kind of come back, and he relived these old memories. And Charles Ignatius Pfaff, the proprietor, was still there, still working. And he actually, when Whitman walked in, Pfaff went and fetched one of his finest bottles of wine from the cellar, and he poured a glass of wine for himself, one for Whitman. As Whitman described, they sat down for a pleasant hour and talked about the old days. And as Whitman said, he said, it really moved him. He described it as those times, that place. He really looked back on that time at Pfaff's as something that had really shaped him as an artist.
Does it strike you the incredible irony, maybe irony is the wrong word, maybe it's the right word, that Artemus Ward, who one of his biggest fans was President Lincoln, Artemus Ward hangs out with Walt Whitman, and he hangs out with John Wilkes Booth to a degree. John Wilkes Booth takes the life of Abraham Lincoln in a twisted kind of a circle there. I'm curious, as a result of all that, what the Bohemians thought of how did they treat John Wilkes Booth's family, etc., after all this came out?
Yeah, well, a couple of them were really close to Edwin Booth, including a lesser light in this group, but a guy named William Winter. Several of these guys, also a guy named Thomas Aldrich. These were guys who sat along that long table. They liked anybody who had any dealings with John Wilkes Booth found him strange. It was obviously shocking when he killed the president, but it wasn't like anybody's sympathies lay with him. People really liked Edwin Booth. He was the brother. He was a very winning person. A lot of people in the circle liked Edwin a lot. The best way to put it is they felt that he'd been done a kind of a terrible injustice. I mean, what a terrible thing that his brother had killed the president. And of course, as you might imagine, his brother killing the president was devastating to his acting career for Edwin Booth, because people, it really tarred his name and so forth. And so a lot of the people in the FAF circle actually came to Edwin's defense and to his aid, because they felt like he'd been been a supporter of abolition and union, and they felt his brother was unstable. He wasn't really responsible for his brother's rash and insane act. So people really kind of rallied behind Edwin. And Edwin, actually, he was a very disciplined, hard-driving guy. And through his strength of character, he was able to get back on his feet as an actor. I mean, he had a long period when his name was sort of his name was, what his brother done has tarred his name as well. But over time, Edwin Booth actually kind of re-established himself as an actor, and people took him seriously, and sort of, for the most part, the American public kind of forgave Edwin his brother's evil act.
Well, it is a fascinating work about fascinating people and fascinating person in that of Walt Whitman, the author Justin Martin, Lawrencian, a good old townie, and again, somewhere in the annals of history or in the annals of eBay, possibly may lie, one of the original issues of the Old West Lawrence Zip. But anyway, the work is, again, it's called Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians by Justin Martin. It is published by DeCapo Press. Hey, Justin, how can people find out more about the work that you do and maybe snag a copy of the book?
Sure. Well, it's sort of one-stop shopping for people. I've got a website, which is Justin Martin, my name, with the number 1.com. So justinmartin1.com, and from there they can learn more about me and my work. Link up to my Facebook page or other pages. Link up to buy the book various places such as IndieBound or Amazon.com. So that's the one-stop shopping way of contacting me.
Now, we also want to let people know you'll actually be in town. So tell us about that.
That is correct. Sure. I will be speaking at the Spencer Library on October 24th at 10:30 in the morning, and very much looking forward to that.
Well, it would be a great way to meet Lawrencian done good, and he went east instead of going west, but he's done quite well. Hey, Justin, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and best of luck to you in the future.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.